Thank you for having me, Morteza. I want to start off with telling you my story. So when I worked in a communications role in one of the schools at Boston University, a higher up I reported to on the school's website charmed me. She'd frequently pass along compliments to me from professors who I worked with and getting their research out, and I felt really supported by her until I didn't. Months into the job, I found myself at a work gathering where she excitedly told me that she had a grad student to help me. This was for relaunching part of the school's website. And I had no idea that that conversation would mark the beginning of not only a devaluation of my work, but also of me as a person. She removed some of my responsibilities with no communication as to why. She put me down at meetings, she gossiped about me, and then came this false accusation, along with a written warning for violating a rule that didn't exist about swapping out news on the website homepage without committee approval after I spoke up. I was at the mercy of a toxic higher up, and I had no idea what to call this behavior. Um, Knowing that she mistreated several other women at the school, one who left in an ambulance from the stress, I reported it to the head dean, then to human resources, then later to the provost's office. And at every turn, I was either blown off or further blamed. And I knew if the administration didn't care about the situation and wasn't going to help me, the school no longer served me because they didn't support my well being. But that realization didn't stop the anxiety, the sleepless nights. I sat at my desk wondering what her next move would be and when it would come. I wondered what I would do to protect myself when no one else would. I continued to suffer. Sorry. How could one insecure, power hungry higher up try to derail my career just because she wanted to without consequence? So luckily I found another job at another institution within a couple of months, but I never stopped thinking about what I experienced. I wondered, how could this behavior be allowed, never mind be legal? And how could the employer ignore her behavior and embolden her by not even investigating, never mind holding her accountable? And who is holding the employer accountable for their negligence? This abuse happened back in 2007, and I knew that it it was eventually found out that it was called workplace bullying, and it took me some time to even know what to call the experience. I knew I wouldn't be the first person or the last person to experience it, but I was determined to do something about it. I knew I had to do my part to educate others about this behavior so they wouldn't feel so desperately misunderstood and unseen like I did. I knew I had to do what I could to help other workers navigate the betrayal of a workplace culture that says it's okay not only for employees to psychologically abuse others, but for employers to ignore it. I found a professor who'd written a piece of workplace anti-abuse legislation. I had zero political experience, but I did know how to write, design, and message the public. So I designed graphics and blogged around the issue of workplace abuse and the legislation, and soon an email base was hatched. And over the years, as I read story after story of psychological abuse, I saw that toxic employees expose their own fear of losing control when competent workers pose a threat to them. That unchecked fear, sense of entitlement, and lack of accountability embolden toxic bosses who try to protect their often unearned power and control. And employers most often either do nothing to protect those of us who are harmed or they join in. I wanted to expose that culture that didn't value me and so many others who look like me. Positive stereotypes around whiteness, manhood, heterosexuality, cisgender, middle age, and higher wages often equate with invulnerability, though many in these groups are also bullied and mobbed. Many bosses and employers have the power and privilege to control the narrative to keep power over workers, including subjective performance reviews with outright lies, sabotage through closed door conversations, and division of workers to keep patterns reduced to he said, she said stories. They can work without tight scrutiny from above. They can speak up without fear of retaliation or minimization. They can see people of their gender, race, class, ability, and sexual orientation at the top and in the history of their organizations, normalizing their looking the part of leader. They can be in the company of people of their same gender, race, class, ability, and sexual orientation most of the time and feel part of the in crowd, even promoting them rather than outnumbered, out of place, unheard, invisible, feared, or seen as a token hire. They can minimize and ignore those not in the in crowd, forcing their positions in the in crowd. They can use positive stereotypes to kiss up and negative stereotypes to kick down. They can stand by white patriarchal norms even if they are not white or men. They can count on their identity to give their views more weight and respect and less questioning during meetings. They can have a medical complication, a leave of absence, or a difficult span of time, resulting in a lower performance without higher-ups attributing problems to their identity. They can use doctors they pay to dismiss valid claims of workplace harm to others. They can pay themselves high wages while paying their employees poverty wages, using them as welfare to reinforce their power. They can do well without being called a credit to some aspect of their identity, and they can never be asked to speak for all members of their identity groups. When we put the agency back on perpetrators, we name these problems as actions based on entitlement for those in the norm whose privilege remains invisible to everyone but those outside the norm and those catering to this entitlement. So if any of these have ever applied to you, feel free to raise your hand. You've wondered if your mistreatment is due to a performance issue or your skin color, your accent, your class, gender, ability, age, sexual orientation, religion, size, politics, or other difference. You've hid part of who you are, such as your socioeconomic class, your sexual orientation, gender identity, religious beliefs, political beliefs, age, education, and fear of no longer belonging to the privileged group. You've seen speaking up to HR or higher-ups as a dead-end route when you've seen that route not go well for your coworkers. You've had to choose between your health and a paycheck when abuse of power made you stressed and or fearful. You've internalized oppression as trauma and insecurity and then felt blame and shame for struggling, less than, fearful, uncomfortable, or alienated. You know that even anti-discrimination law hasn't disrupted the status quo, and that if you go up against your employer, you'll be one person against an army and a system. You see the courts treat employment discrimination as a set of individual cases of intentional misbehavior instead of a widespread systemic culture of bias and discrimination in the organization of workplaces. If you've used the legal system to go up against discrimination, you know your identity worked against you with lawyers and in court and subjected you to re-trauma. You eventually knew the only justice you could seek was monetary, even if it only covered your legal bills, and that your employer wasn't going to reinstate your job, hold the bully accountable, or change the work culture. You knew the case outcome would stay hidden for the employer, but could jeopardize your own future career prospects. Reporters often leave perpetrators, toxic employers, and abusive bosses and coworkers out of rare headlines about workplace abuse, rendering these perpetrators invisible and invincible. This practice normalizes abuse of workers in a fear-based culture, keeping too many workers glorifying power, trying to prove we have what it takes to play the game, and stomping on each other to climb the ladder. Most of us unconsciously subscribe to this myth that equates and even romanticizes success with power and shame with lack of it. White men still retain the largest share of power in the US private sector workforce. Discrimination continues at an unchanged rate since anti-discrimination law began in 1964. There are still major earning disparities based on race and gender. In 2014, median outcomes for Asian American and white men were nearly twice the median incomes for Latinx workers. Unless we reflect on these harmful problems of implicit bias and discrimination, we will repeat them in our advocacy work. With our goal of ending identity, determining destiny, and embracing inspiration, care, and connection, what's feminized in our culture, former target victim Vicky Cordemunch and I set out to fight against worker dehumanization, especially of those who aren't part of the identity-based club. In a space in which we walk the talk, We wanted to create a movement and space that challenged stereotypes and social hierarchies, embraced collaboration, centered equity, and prioritized action. We want those harmed by a toxic combination of mistreatment, social power, and entitlement to divorce themselves from their lack of power and lean into their personal and collective power. So together we exert influence over our employers, legislators, and legal system to protect employees from psychological abuse and prioritize employee well-being. So in 2022, we founded End Workplace Abuse. We simultaneously drafted the Workplace Psychological Safety Act using the Puerto Rico law and international workplace anti-abuse laws as a guide, making the Workplace Psychological Safety Act the only bill rooted in lived experience and based on 4 decades of research. So our lived experience taught us 4 important insights. The first is that employers are not liable for psychologically abusive behavior, nor do they want to be. In toxic work environments, employers choose to view psychologically abusive complaints through an inadequate lens, a loophole in anti-discrimination law, to serve their own purpose of controlling the outcome and getting rid of the reporting employee who presents a threat of liability and threat to their power. The ineffectiveness of their reporting processes is by design to maintain their power. Number 2, this phenomenon has a discriminatory impact on people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ+ community, workers with disabilities, and those who intersect with these identities. It is rooted in a system of oppression that values and positively stereotypes some people and devalues and negatively stereotypes others through racism, sexism, heteronormativity, transphobia, classism, ableism, ageism, and more ways of othering those whose competence those in power see as a threat. The court's shift in the 1980s from viewing the discriminatory impact on an aggrieved party to having to prove the intent of the perpetrator has rendered anti-discrimination laws ineffective at dismantling social hierarchies, leaving both those in protected groups and outside of them unprotected from workplace psychological abuse, according to researchers Ellen Berry, Robert L. Nelson, and Laura Beth Nielsen in their landmark study on the long-term effectiveness of anti-discrimination law in their book, Rights on Trial. While hostile work environments are prohibited under such federal anti-discrimination statutes as Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, victims do not have a legal claim if they cannot tie the abuse to discriminatory intent. A hostile work environment not associated with an employee's membership in a protected group is not actionable under these laws. According to researchers, quote, the courts have moved in the direction of treating employment discrimination as a set of individual cases of intentional misbehavior, while the social science literature on discrimination increasingly points to a widespread systemic character of bias in the organization of workplaces. Number 3, the Workplace Psychological Safety Act needed to be in line with sexual harassment law, so targeted and victimized employees don't have to prove intent or health harm. 2 burdensome requirements that would do little to move the needle on psychologically safer workplaces. And number 4, we needed to warn and educate employees while raising public awareness of this perpetration. There's a playbook as to how this issue typically works. Its root problem lies in the complicity of toxic employers by ignoring the widespread problem of psychologically abusive behavior and the employees who report the deviant behavior in order to thwart threats of liability. The employer's representative employees create a false narrative to vilify, then push out those who speak up by reporting the abusive behavior. Unsuspecting employees are led to believe there's a legitimate complaint process to remedy the problem, but most often the employer does nothing or retaliates. The employer fails to alter the employee's work environment by removing the abusive employee. The emboldened bully continues to abuse their target without consequence or deterrent. The employee is trapped. The bully won't let up. The employer won't help. and bystanders won't speak up, fearing they are next. The distress of a toxic work environment takes its toll. There are 3 outcomes highly affiliated with this phenomenon. The employee voluntarily leaves due to significant health harm, is fired as a result of the health harm as they are no longer able to perform their jobs, or they die. The bully is happy, their perceived threat of competition is gone. The mob, the employer or representative employees, is also happy, their perceived threat of liability is gone. Fear takes over the work culture, undermining collaboration and performance, and sometimes escalating into homicide or suicide. In 2 years, we've amassed a quickly growing base of thousands of advocates who've lived and breathed these tools of oppression by pulling back the curtain on what's happening. We've shown advocates the tools abusers and employers use to oppress them. They could see their experiences were the same and feel validated, like I needed back in 2007. Some voluntarily left work due to health harm, some were fired. Most have suffered from significant stress, resulting in significant physical, mental, emotional, or economic injury. They've suffered from anxiety, depression, from the direct personal denigration and being treated as invisible. They've shown decreased interest in their appearance, punctuality, and productivity. They've become defensive, hypervigilant, or socially withdrawn. They've felt desperation, helplessness, despair, and rage about lack of legal remedies. They've suffered from damaged reputations, job loss, ruined future career and financial prospects. While most of these injuries are invisible, injury from abuse is visible on brain scans, much like smoking causes invisible physical injury. In the recent past, laws were enacted to protect workers from smoke due to scientific evidence of harm. Unsuspecting employees do nothing to provoke these harms, but when they realize the institutional duplicity and complicity of tampering with their health and livelihood, forcing them off the payroll to avoid liability, they suffer more trauma when they realize there's no legal recourse for any of it. Employers don't pick up the tab for harm they cause, taxpayers do. Employers externalize the costs of employee well-being onto taxpayers through healthcare costs and social services costs, instead of preventing thousands of stress-related deaths internally because no one's holding them accountable to do so. Toxic work culture, in part from this playbook, tops the list of factors that contribute to psychologically unsafe work environments, as shown by record attrition rates. And these are employees lost over a period of time who are not replaced. A 2022 MIT Sloan study found that corporate culture is a much more reliable predictor of industry-adjusted attrition than how employees assess their compensation. A toxic corporate culture is 10.4 times more powerful than compensation in predicting a company's attrition rate compared with its industry. These problems sit against a backdrop of other tools employers use to maintain power. Unlivable wages for employees, wages for themselves nearly 400 times that of a typical worker, that increased by nearly 1,500% since 1978. Forced arbitration to put themselves above the law, non-disclosure agreements to hide serial abuse and silence victims, at-will employment to allow employers to fire employees for any reason or no reason, so long as it's not discriminatory, unfair scheduling practices, ability to inquire about pay history to reinforce gender inequities, wage theft, increased corporate lobbying, and more. For far too long, we've hoped employers would use existing tools to police themselves, but they don't. Their ears are attuned to their legal department's rhetoric, avoid liabilities at all costs. Training and policies don't work by themselves, according to Rights on Trial. There is a trend in which courts have excused employers from liability if employers have adopted policies, even when the policy may not actually be effective. Courts increasingly defer to defenses based on employers' assertions that they have compliance structures in place without probing as to whether these systems amount to anything more than symbolic compliance. Workers' compensation insurance plans don't provide adequate relief to employees harmed by toxic environments either. Employers who pay the premiums are the owners of work workers' compensation insurance plans and exercise control over them. Intentional infliction of emotional distress law requires proof of intent and severity. Having to prove intent is an extremely high threshold. And the International Trade Union Confederation's 2022 Global Rights Index indicates 65 major developed countries have fewer systemic violations of workers' rights than the US. We're clearly not practicing what we preach. In 1970, we passed the OSH Act that assures every working man and woman in the nation safe and healthful work conditions, including the psychological factors involved. It calls for establishing causal connections between diseases and work and environmental conditions by providing medical criteria which will assure insofar as practicable that no employee will suffer diminished health, functional capacity, or life expectancy as a result of his work experience. OSH Act duty states each employer shall furnish to each of his employees employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The International Organization for Standardization deems bullying and harassment as among the most significant psychosocial hazards. The World Health Organization, International Labor Organization Joint Policy Brief on Mental Health at Work says unsafe working environments related to job content, work schedule, specific workplace characteristics, or opportunities for career development, among other things, create risk factors for mental health. As if human rights violations aren't enough, the business case also hasn't worked to convince employers otherwise. Workplace abuse costs our economy billions in turnover, lost opportunity, absenteeism, presenteeism, litigation, severances, settlements, workers' comp claims, and disability insurance claims. Yet when the US passed the OSH Act, physical safety increased significantly. Employers work to minimize physical hazards according to regulations. Why? To avoid liability. Workers need the same protections from psychosocial hazards. Employers need to be positively incentivized to minimize psychosocial hazards and provide psychologically safe work environments. Employers simply have way too much power. It's time to say we're not going to allow our government to tolerate abuse at work. Just as our government steps in with abusive families, our government needs to take action with toxic employers. We need to provide a tool for human resources to hold abusers accountable and reduce risk from bullying, harassment, and mobbing. The Workplace Psychological Safety Act will hold employers accountable and give targeted employees legal recourse for toxic work environments that a reasonable person would deem toxic. Targeted employees, if this bill passes, will be able to call for an internal investigation, bypass a rigged internal process by calling for handling through the state Human Rights Commission. So there's an option for low-wage workers to have a fighting chance against employers who build legal responses into their budgets, which can include tuition fees, tax dollars, and insurance money. Or sue the employer or individuals in violation of the act directly for economic, compensatory, or punitive damages and attorney's fees. They can also choose to anonymously publicly disclose the case outcome, removing employers' ability to silence them with non-disclosure agreements. If passed, the bill would also require employers to acknowledge, monitor, detect, prevent, discourage, and adequately address incidences of psychological abuse. Employers will no longer be allowed to sweep abuse under the rug and pretend they're following protocol while ignoring abuse or retaliating to avoid liability. They'll be required to adopt and implement policies and training and conduct an annual anonymous workplace climate survey to monitor the prevalence of abuse in their workplaces. Employers control the work environment, but laws and regulations control the employers. A law is about moving the needle on prevention. We lose more workers each year, at least 4,000, to preventable occupational injury, including psychological injury, than we did on 9/11, nearly 3,000. After 9/11, our government instituted expensive and comprehensive homeland security regulations to prevent another dramatic loss of life. Yet we have a gaping hole in our workplace safety policy. When countries have laws against psychological abuse at work, incidences of workplace bullying decrease, improving the safety of the work environment. Countries with workplace bullying law like France show lower rates of workplace bullying than the US. In fact, the US is the only Western industrialized nation without a law, except recently in the US territory of Puerto Rico, that addresses psychological abuse at work. Workplace psychological safety is the only component of worker total health unaddressed in US law, according to the National Institute for Occupational Health, Safety and Health in their April 2016 National Agenda to Advance Total Worker Health Research Practice Policy and Capacity. Workplace psychological safety, those three words are the basics, and it is resonating with those affected and those who enact our laws. When we pull back the curtain on this rigged system, targets of workplace abuse begin to see they're not the problem. Once they feel ready over time, they take their voices back by advocating for the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. They own their own narratives rather than internalize the lies from their abusers and employers to define themselves. They see they're one of many on the receiving end of organizational gaslighting, and that together we can use our voices to relieve each other of pain from the betrayal trauma at a minimum and fight for protections to prevent abuse at a maximum. And we're doing exactly that. In 2 years to this month, we've amassed a base of thousands of workers who want to take action, who we inform of our progress along the way. We've identified 24 issues pushed in states across the nation we can take action on to join other organizations to move the needle on workers' rights. We've built a national team dedicated to outreach to national organizations, marketing campaigns, working with businesses, training and managing our volunteers, and automating our processes. We've organized advocates and experts at a hearing in Massachusetts last fall, about 40 in-person and remote testifiers from such areas as employment law, neuroscience, psychology, coaching, occupational safety, human resources, unions, and academia spoke out against workplace abuse. Gretchen Carlson, who went up against Roger Ailes of Fox News, and Harvey Weinstein survivor Rowena Chu both testified in support of the bill, along with an estimated 1,000 advocates with lived experience through written testimony. Last year, we passed the bill through the Rhode Island State Senate. We testified in front of the Rhode Island Senate Labor Committee just last week, and we'll testify again later this year in front of the Rhode Island House Labor Committee. Now that we have both a Senate lead sponsor and a House lead sponsor in Rhode Island, we hope to gain traction in Rhode Island to leverage traction in other states. And we've trained hundreds of advocates on introducing the bill in their states, leading to teams in more than 20 states who are taking action for a slate of new bills in 2025. Advocates are inspired to use their collective power to create change, knowing it's the strategy that's worked to create social change throughout history, to move the needle on a more equitable culture. It's what will move the needle on stopping normalizing entitlement, which results in thousands of managers trying to prove their identity fits the part, regardless of merit, when they resort to childish behavior and perpetuate abuse to boost their fragile egos and maintain their positions of power. We often define strength for higher-ups and managers as controlling the most people with the most freedom, with the ability to do the most damage. This definition cheapens the real definition of strength, which is treating employees as human beings with empathy, dignity, and respect, checking implicit bias and fear-based thoughts, and appreciating those who challenge the idea that working requires internal competition, kissing up, kicking down, joining in with toxicity, remaining silent, and boosting our own egos by psychologically abusing others. These employees who challenge the toxicity of the majority of work environments welcome divergent thoughts and different ways of being. They include improvement, growth, and embracing of change and differences, in both their organizations and themselves. So it's time to accept the days of lack of opportunity to get into positions of power reinforced by bias systems are still alive and well. These systems and the behaviors that support them influence whether people get jobs, advance, support themselves financially, achieve career goals, and contribute to generational wealth. It's time to recognize the power and control narrative and the value we as a culture place on it. It's time to acknowledge meritocracy and equality as myths and a system of privilege and oppression as a reality. This system, rooted in ignorance and arrogance, grants those in the norm permission to belong, dominate, hurt, neglect, and ignore others, and the rest of us to assimilate, obey, and suffer. It's time to be willing to see our invisible, normalized, unearned privilege around race, gender, age, ethnicity, ability, nationality, religion, or sexual orientation. It's time to stop simply disapproving of this system, become outraged about it enough to proactively give up power through anti-ism work so we can share power. It's time to have conversations about privilege and invisible systems, even if they're messy and uncomfortable. It's time to take action by supporting the Workplace Psychological Safety Act and use it as a tool to educate others, help them take their voices back, help prevent abuse at work, chip away at redesigning the rigged system, and redistribute power rather than keep it in the hands of those who currently write the rules. It's only through walking the talk together through collective action that we will see change. We can all use our voices as experts and advocates to say that we deserve better. So go to WPSAct.org to lend your voice. Will you join us?